Prof, thank you so much for joining us once again. It's like an annual annual discussion between Prof Stefan. I want to talk about the understanding the development and also poverty. This is something that's very close to our heart in Malaysia and ASEAN, especially. We are the chairman of ASEAN this year. We also have this discussion in World Economic Forum recently. I want to talk about because your work, you emphasizes a lot of about risk, resilience, and also poverty as well. But how do you see that the global understand the poverty evolved since pandemic COVID-19 and also since climate change and also post political instability currently?
So looking back a couple of decades, 3 decades or so, of course, we had an enormous improvement in the well-being and the welfare of the poorest groups in the world. You know, the World Bank would estimate that roughly from about 2 billion people living in extreme poverty, we went down to around 700 or 800 million people in the world. So this is since 1990. So this is massive progress. COVID, of course, stopped this progress, and we know this very well. And in all countries, we know that people prove to be very vulnerable to these kind of shocks, and indeed, poverty numbers shot up. But the good news is, globally, we're more or less back on the trajectory where we were by 2019. So actually, even though probably global poverty may well have increased in the extreme forms by about 100 million, 150 million, again, the progress, not least in Asia, has been actually quite positive. However, it illustrates very well of how precarious still these living conditions are. So if people talk about the extreme poverty, we talk about the most extreme thing. It's basically people who have purchasing power of about $2.15 in New York. Now, if you've ever been to New York or the US, you can't buy very much with $2.15. It would translate in Malaysia maybe in $1.50. You can't live on very much with $1.50. And so it's people below even that. So a lot of the population, at least in Asia and in the ASEAN, has, you know, we have seen this progress over the last 3-4 decades, that they've moved above that line, but it's still a very precarious set of living conditions. And indeed, this is why, you know, growth and development need to kind of continuously try to absorb a lot of these people, creating jobs and fulfilling the aspirations also of these poorer populations. So when we then look at climate change, it's again one of these big potential shocks that it could have. You know, we see it already locally in particular settings where these extreme events happen. It's a bit like what COVID did at a global scale, locally, that a lot of people will be very precarious, pushed in. And again, it will take them several years to come back into their position. I don't think we should look at it as if suddenly the whole world impoverishes further at the same time. But what climate change does is make extreme events maybe not more regular, but definitely more intense. And so the kind of shocks that people have to experience will be really severe and pushing people that may have improved their living conditions a bit suddenly back into much more vulnerable and poor positions.
You mentioned about the $2.15 per day metrics, but do you believe that that is still relevant, given that, you know, poverty is a thing that's it is basically a multi-dimensional? And then do you think that we should adopt more comprehensive multi-dimensional approach and metrics and so?
So there's a few things to be said about it. You know, we use this metric largely because if we go back to 1990, a huge amount of people were below that line. So it's relevant in your society that has a good way of categorizing the most extreme forms of poverty. But of course, well-being is more than just about having $1.50 to consume. And so this is where you're right in saying, you know, that these poverty lines, as we use them within our societies, have to reflect social realities. In fact, most countries should have their own poverty line that is relevant for their society. Of course, you can't put a poverty line where, say, 95% of the population doesn't achieve it, because then it is meaningless again. It is, you know, think of the poverty line as a construct that tries to focus on a group of people that is very much marginalized. Should it be multidimensional? Of course, our lives are multidimensional. You know, we have all kinds of aspirations and not just having enough food. So yes, it should be, and again, it should reflect what is there in society. However, one important thing to recognize is that when we look over long periods of time, these multiple dimensions that people typically include, like health, education, and so on, and water and sanitation and so on, they move very closely together with this kind of poverty line. So for the kind of longer term trajectory, it doesn't quite matter whether we use multidimensional or whether we use what I was describing. The more important thing is that you draw a line somewhere that people in a society feel this will define someone who's deprived. And is this multiple or single dimensional? I don't matter that much. It's part of what society values, and then that needs to be reflected by that benchmark.
There's a conversation back in my country, Malaysia, about the absolute poverty, especially the absolute poverty line in Malaysia, in order to move up all this group above the absolute poverty line. But as we mentioned about the multidimensional, and also at the same time, we had this discussion in WEF as well about the planetary health, how it contributes to poverty in a lot of countries in the world. But how do you view the multi-pronged approach in tackling poverty, especially in regards to the planetary health as well? Because a lot of government seems to, did not get the correlation between planetary health and also how it can contribute to poverty, especially in the global south countries.
Yeah. So, look, when you are walking around some of the poorer, densely populated areas of Kuala Lumpur, if you walk around in any city in Malaysia, if you walk around any city in Asia, you clearly see that environmental issues must be part of the well-being of people. For example, people talk a lot these days about lead pollution and the pollution that comes from the way water is distributed and indeed cooking happens, and all the kind of poisonous air that comes around and how it affects it. We are definitely, if you're a poor city dweller, environmental matters clearly matter for you. So they should be part of your conceptualization of extreme poverty. And so, but there is another side to it that I want to allude to. There's a lot of people say, well, we have to have this into our concept of poverty, and this, and this, and this. I've worked as an advisor in government. I've worked inside government. Now, the last thing you want to do is confuse the decision makers by trying to lump all these things together. And you get some kind of an index and say, oh, so many percentage of population is below some kind of multidimensional. The policymaker will ask, no, what do I do now? Oh no, we better take it apart again. And so don't underestimate the ability of a policymaker, of a decision maker, to actually separate, say, air pollution issues from material living standards issues, from food quality issues, and so on. Because that's how you do policy. You improve these things. So let's not make this debate something that in the end may give us a philosophically better concept, but practically quite a useless one for policy. So I'm a pragmatist in these things. Talk about all the things that you allude to, the multidimensionality, the aspects of deprivation, the different multidimensional aspects of deprivation in your country. But just keep them a little bit apart, because otherwise we have no idea of how to actually begin to deal with it. And just thinking the concept needs to be all together, it will probably confuse more than actually help. But yes, all these dimensions will matter, and the big problem for a policymaker will be the people who are affected, say, by intensive air pollution will, for example, be urban Malaysians. The people who are most affected, probably still by very poor nutrition, will be in East Malaysia, will be in the countryside. So the policymaker needs to make these trade-offs. Again, lumping it all together doesn't help anyone. Let's make sure we work on the food security of poor populations in one part of the country, in the countryside, work on the air pollution, and basically focus on those things that matter most for the most deprived people in the country in the different parts. But choices will need to be made, and let's not confuse.
Of course, the policy falls on the shoulder of the federal government. But in Malaysia and many Southeast Asia countries, we keep talking about decentralization in terms of policy and given more autonomy to the states and also the districts itself, because they know their people and the problem in that particular area. But how do you see this decentralization? Because in Southeast Asia, for instance, this is something sort of taboo to be discussed, and having autonomy in the particular state is something that we are not really, because it will open the door for corruption and all that. But how do you view, how do we strike a balance on this issue?
Well, you already allude to it. it has to be finding that balance, because the closer you get anything to do with policies that affect people very directly, social policies, things like health, education, nutrition, the closer you bring it to them, probably the better you will end up doing it. But the other risk is that you often decentralize to the lowest level of competence. And basically, and you allude to corruption, it's not just that, you know, sometimes these things are really hard. Now, Malaysia, being the kind of educated groups it has, civil service that arguably should be competent, it will then, a lot will have to do with making sure the right people in charge at the local level to do these things. Just the illusion of saying, as long as we decentralize, it's good, we should just be very careful about. But it is a standard thing that the more capability governments develop, the richer countries become, the better it will be to decentralize as much as you can. Because, you know, in Kuala Lumpur, it becomes very hard then to actually see the detail of the policy making that needs to be done in a particular district or something. So yes, so move on that, but let's make sure, don't make it an ideology that decentralization must be the right answer to all problems, because then you see the problems of competence and corruption that you described.
I want to talk about in the context of ASEAN as well, because we have Bangladesh who would like to join ASEAN, but at the same time, we have the advisor to the interim government, Professor Yunus, said that the ASEAN should have its own mold and also standard in terms of development and also tackling its own problems. But how do you view ASEAN, especially, moving away from the standard of development frameworks, in the sense that we've seen throughout the world?
Well, look, ASEAN, its emergence, its reflections, a lot to do with the trade bloc, with a place where certain things can happen. Of course, I myself come from Belgium, Brussels, center of the European Union. You see all the sides to this. You know, there is a huge attraction to try to strengthen by forming a collective in all kinds of areas and setting up standards. The real issue becomes, you know, again, in the conversation which is happening, do they reflect the nuance and the diversity of all the member states and all the cultural and political cultural things that are different? And at the same time, you know, do you decentralize so much that actually the quality of delivery on the ground gets disrupted? So I like, I have a huge admiration for Professor Yunus and the Bangladeshi government. I would call it the best and the most well-meaning government in the world at the moment. You know, these individuals in there are amazing. And I think it's right to normatively put a challenge out to ASEAN. But let's be cautious of how, because in the end, normative principles need to be translated in practice. And we know all endless unions of countries that in words said all kinds of things, but in deeds couldn't deliver anything. So keep in mind, how could we deliver this in an ASEAN setup? I think it's an important organization, and it's relevant to strengthen it, but just always think, where can we add value and where can we make sure there is implementation possible, rather than lots of lofty standards and indeed the creation of new bureaucracies and so on that doesn't help anyone.
But based on your observation, do we get it right in terms of the practicality of and execution of all the policies in ASEAN especially? Well,
look, I'm not an expert on the detail. I just do remember that when I was working in the UK government, they were dying to become members. And, you know, if it is a club they were dying to be members of, you know, this kind of an interesting thing. It became one of our main foreign policy objective of the foreign secretary at the time I was working with, to actually become a member. So you must be doing something right, and you must be seen as either already or definitely potentially an important bloc that brings some balance in the kind of geopolitics, the geopolitical complexity of Asia as it is developing now. So I think it is a very valuable institution and it has its place. And, you know, just look at all the Western countries that would like to have a good link with it. Yeah. You must be doing something right.
Right. As you know, that Malaysia is the trading nation, so we're quite open and we try to strike a balance between all countries. However, right now we've seen a lot of protectionism in many countries of the world, especially after Trump becoming the 47th US president, and we've seen few things being announced by him, but how do you see that all the efforts put in place being hindered by the protectionism, the characteristics that we have around the world?
Yeah. So look, we'll have to see how it all pans out. You know, every day there is a new development in the story around tariffs and so on, and how they're going to be used. So you know, in 2 weeks it may look very different. So, but a few things you have to keep in mind. And the one thing that worries me greatly is that in general, I worry that Trump may be right that actually it will pay for the US. And it's a very simple principle. There is something in economics talking about optimal tariff policy.
Right.
And that actually if you have market power, you can actually influence the price. And the US has in certain value chains, because of its massive consumer markets, quite a lot of influence. At the same time, it typically has most influence in those product areas where it has serious domestic industries that it could compete with. So this is where Canada should be more scared of it all than probably the ASEAN countries, because the industrial structures in Asia are very much complementary to what the US is producing itself. The basic consumer goods stills and so on. And in that sense, it's not for nothing that in the early days, Canada was threatened by 25% and China by 10%, because the technical people in the Trump administration will recognize that tariffs may be less effective relative to Asian countries.
Right.
And so in that sense, I think, as seen from Asia, you know, it's going to be rocky and it's going to be, you know, a stormy environment for a while. But there is potential. There are things that can be done. There are, and there is still opportunities to be taken. China in itself may be a little bit more complicated, but most of the other Asian countries can also take advantage of the decoupling. So actually, all these things may well be a massive opportunity for Asian countries and members of ASEAN, of many of the members. It will depend a bit on country by country, how they play the game relative to China versus the US. But many of them, and dare I say including Malaysia, are quite good at playing that game, that political game. And they will have to. But if they maneuver well, then actually the consequences may be a bit less than maybe sometimes people fear. I think for Europe and for Canada, it's probably far worse. That's where we have the same industrial structures than the US has. Therefore, tariffs going up will give a boost to their domestic industries in a way that we will not get in the same way for Asian economies.
Again, I want to quote Prof Yunus, because he mentioned that the concentration of wealth is very important. And then at the same time, he gives an example of how we should have a bank that started off not just based on wealth and the certain part of the population, but also a bank that started off with the poverty community, for instance. But how practical it is to be implemented in terms of the ideas at current global state? And
are you referring to like the ideas of Professor Yunus and so on? Yes. Well, you know, while Professor Yunus is a great man and his ideas were very influential, the way they started out initially with microcredit by targeting the poorest people, most of the research evidence tells us that it actually doesn't work that well. His ideas were especially right for people that were not the very poorest, but a little bit above, small enterprises, some other things and so on, because you know, the bankability of the poorest is really tricky. You know, we were referring earlier to their deep vulnerability, to their deep things. So a small thing that would happen is really, really difficult for very poor people to deal with. These days, we say for the very poorest, we're probably talking much more about things like social protection, cash transfers as the right way of buffering and helping them up in the world. But otherwise, a little bit higher up, banks that actually really target better, you know, some of these micro enterprises, some of these informal sector enterprises and so on. We have good examples in the world that actually built on Professor Yunus's ideas that actually can make it, indeed can actually make it a marketable opportunity, you know, that can be also profit making and so on. So these things are there, but always you have to remember, and that's a great lesson from Bangladesh we have to understand. the return to all these intensive microcredit type of operations was also largely possible because the economy as a whole was growing. So it becomes a real bank that allowed very poor people to be included in the growth of the country. It's not in itself a solution for those countries, including in Asia, that are still quite stagnant. Because if the growth is not there, then actually these microcredit operations probably are not going to have these big returns. But the return will especially be high if, as a way of including poorer groups of the population, smaller enterprise and so on, into the growth overall. So yes, in that sense, it's a very powerful tool, and more could be done. But there is a lot of it there, so there's a lot to be learned from. We should never be naive about it, and always be careful that we look at how effective they are. But there is a scope for progress there.
He also mentioned about how technology basically changed the youth in Bangladesh, and then it should be studied by the countries around the world. It's not just about the youth understand what's happening in the world and also their particular countries, but how do we solve problems? Now we talk about AI. In World Economic Forum, they talk about AGI, artificial general intelligence, that will happen in the future. But how do you see the AI and the technological advancement, which just advanced so fast that we cannot catch up sometimes? Can help reduce the time frame in solving poverty issue, for instance. But how do you see this thing?
Well, there's one thing about AI, of course, and we start using it now all the time, is that it still does it all on the data that already exists.
Right.
It's not inventing new data. It's not an independent, but it processes it very effectively and does it all very, very well. So, as seen from poverty, it becomes a very fast learning tool from good experiences from other things. So it allows a much faster feedback mechanism to do the right things.
Right.
That's the first thing. It's still relatively new, we would say, but at some point a spreadsheet was also very new, and everybody thought it would change all kinds of operations in business. We learn very quickly how to use it. Students, young people learn very quickly how to use it. And then, human intelligence tends to be still largely complementary to all these things that emerge. So if we find the right complementarities, yes, we can actually help to do very effective things. I'll give you an example that I have seen in AI that actually in poverty reduction can really help. So we do know that, and I alluded to it, there's a lot of good schemes, social protection schemes, targeted schemes for poor people, but often the problem is that poor people find it very hard to apply for these. So I saw actually, within weeks of ChatGPT emerging the first time, I saw in India, and it was of course typically again in Bangalore, people very quickly translated the whole thing in 27 languages and actually put a voice recognition on it, so that basically someone could just talk to a poor person about their living conditions, and AI filled in the entire application for the cash transfer without them having to do it. Now it's these things. So again, we can fasten, good things that exist but are hard to implement, we can increase their speed of actually making sure people can have access.
All right. Prof Stefan, we don't have much time. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you again next year. There's some of the brilliant ideas that can be implemented, not just from ASEAN's perspective, Malaysia perspective, and also developing countries' perspective. Thank you so much again.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you.